For most of you, if you were paying attention at the beginning or today, Memorial Day is a part of this holiday. So we say, where did it begin? It's hard to find a true beginning. We talked a couple weeks ago about Mother's Day and how that Greece and Rome had holidays or festivals that celebrated mothers, and we see similar things when it comes to memorials as well. But in the United States, almost all of the Memorial Day celebrations, whatever the word, probably wasn't a celebration, but remembrance, all centered around the mid 1800s, somewhere between the Mexican-American War and the Civil War and rightly after. So about 1845 to about 1870, give or take. But this was a time when news maybe didn't travel as fast, and there were celebrations in different places in different times. But I would dare say that anyone who has had a relative killed in military service was probably remembering them long before a specific date was placed on a holiday. But the basic purpose was to remember those who had died in military service. More recent years, it has come to be a holiday not just for military remembrance, but also for those who have passed on regardless of their military status. And you may have went to graves yesterday or today or tomorrow of people that had never held a gun, much less joined the military, but those memories are still celebrated at this time as well. Jimmy read there a handful of verses, and in one of those, John chapter 15 and verse 13, yes, than to lay down. I say that most of us will never be in this situation. There's a handful of you that have served in the military that were a lot closer to that than some of the others. But even some of the folks that are in the military aren't quite as close to that as others would be as well. But whether that situation ever faces us or not, our best memories typically do revolve around some type of sacrifice. I want you to think for just a second. Think about sacrifices that perhaps parents made for you. Do you ever remember those sacrifices? What about sacrifices, maybe something that your friends did for you? And do we ever remember those things that people did for us, places they took us, things they gave us, whatever it would be? It might be that a sacrifice is something that we did for someone. Remember town, places that my friends used to live. And I drive by their house, and not necessarily on purpose, but you're just driving by. And I will sometimes think about things that we carried in there, or carried out of there. Some of those were sacrifices that weren't a lot of fun, but we think about that, right? Those memories sort of hold a place for us. And so I asked the question, why do we feel a need for remembrance in our lives? Why is remembrance important? And why do we sometimes need memorials to help with that remembrance? Well, remembrance is a tricky thing because any story that you tell me will be remembered quite differently by someone else. That's oral history in a nutshell. It's passed down, and we tell the things that we tell, and so sometimes we don't tell all of it. Sometimes we don't tell that on purpose, and sometimes it's just because we don't know. But there are things that I have completely forgotten that happened 20 or 25 or 30 years ago, but a trip down the right street past the right house will help me remember it. And so memorials, when we think of them as sometimes big stone monuments, are not necessarily that. But it triggers this. But if it was not important, I don't think I would remember it. It was funny. Some of you may know Daniel Ritter here in Stanford. And Daniel, he told this several years ago, we were at a funeral and he was telling Mary and me, he was all this, like he said, I remember so well playing summer baseball with Daniel, Daniel. And he rattled off this. We played here and there, and I was just smiling. And we walked around after Mary and said, I don't remember that at all. I didn't remember him being on the team at all, but he clearly was. But it was the memory that had stuck with him, but not with me. Sometimes remembrance is that way, right? The things that you remember might be totally lost on somebody else. But why is remembrance important? Tony and Connie recently spent a week in Washington, D.C., and I'd say that the trip that they took is one that several of you maybe have taken at some point in your life as well. I was surprised that Connie had never been there before, but I know they had a good time. But in Washington, D.C., at the National Mall, the long strip of green space with the reflecting pool there, you walk up and down, and there are all sorts of memorials. I looked and I counted, and it's a little hard to count, but I think there are 14 different ones, and there may be others that are right off to the side, all sorts of different memorials. There are memorials to various events, various wars, but also to various people, the Lincoln Memorial and the Jefferson Memorial to different groups of people as well. And so we have these memorials in a very specific place, pretty much right in the dead center of the capital of our country. But memorials were also found in the Bible. I want to look at a couple of these to start with. Turn to Joshua chapter. You can turn to chapter 4, but I'm going to look at chapter 3 for just a second. But in Joshua chapter 3, the Israelites are led across the Jordan River. And that, for the sake of this story, we can interpret that as being a difficult or complicated procedure. Okay. You might think, well, I cross a river every day on the way to work or on the way to church or whatever it might would be. Well, the rivers that we cross sometimes are a little different because we have bridges that maybe they don't. But if you're trying to take a whole group of people over a large waterway, that can be difficult. But that's not really important, but just kind of get in your mind where it is. But in Joshua chapter 4, it's not so much the crossing, but it's the symbolism of what that means. And I want to look at Joshua chapter 4, verses 4 through 7. They've crossed the river, and Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the children of Israel, one man from every tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and each one of you take up a stone on his shoulder, according to the number of tribes of the children of Israel, that this may be a sign among you, that when your children ask in time to come, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall answer them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord when it crossed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be for a memorial to the children of Israel forever. What he's saying right there is he says, when you cross this, pick a stone up out of the water. He didn't tell them really any specific stone. And there are stones that were there that if they hadn't picked them up, they'd have washed right on down the way. And if they'd come the next day, they'd have had a different set of stones. The old Chinese proverb, right? You never step in the same river twice because it's always moving. Well, the stones are always moving as well. If you've ever stood out in the middle of a creek, you can feel them moving as well. But there are some that are there. He said, pick those up. Now, there's not a single thing significant about the stone that they picked up. It's a rock in a riverbed. But you may have noticed, and I slowed down just a second when we were reading this, that within the reading, Joshua says, when your children ask. What does that mean? Why does he say that? Well, I think the importance here is the importance of passing on memory from one to another. Because if we think about this in our sense, we might think about a mantle or a place in our house that we might set that stone on. I don't know how big it was, whatever it is, that doesn't matter. But at some point, somebody's going to say, what is that rock? Well, let me tell you about that. And that story would pass on. But if there's nothing to memorialize, if there's nothing to trigger that story may never be told. And he would dare say that that story might be forgotten because there's nothing to make that remembrance. This shows the importance, even in the oldest of Old Testament, of passing memory. Exodus chapter 12 and verse 14, the Passover was established as a lasting ordinance. It said, so this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. Notice the word everlasting, right? Last forever, if you read it backwards. This Passover is celebrated today by the Jewish people. It's never changed in thousands of years. A memory that was a memorial that was created. We're commanded quite often by God to remember. And I think it's important that we distinguish between memory and living in the past. There's a distinction there between the two. We shouldn't live in the past. Sometimes there are more memorials that are created, there are monuments, there are things that are created that sort of glorify shameful or negative events. And sometimes we look at that and we say, oh, we should go back. No, that's not what we're talking about here. But there are memories that we have. We shouldn't live in the past, but rather we should learn the applicable lessons, not necessarily as a celebration, but rather as a chance to better ourselves going forward. When those people picked up those stones out of the water, when they talked about that story, there were probably good moments and bad moments of that experience. You ever thought about the people that wandered in the desert with Moses? We don't get a lot of stories from that. Have you ever wondered what they thought that when it was all said and done, how would they have described it, right? We was gone for a long time, right? Well, if we had done this, it would have been better, right? But you remember in the story when they're wandering through the desert and Moses goes up on the mountain, what did the people do? They created a golden calf as an idol right there. Well, I would dare say that when this story was over, when they were finally where they wanted to be, they probably reflected back and said, we probably shouldn't have done that. That might have slowed us down a little bit. I'm using my own language right here. But when we think about things, when we memorialize things, when we remember things, it shouldn't just be a saying, well, everything was better back then. No, it should be a way of saying, what did we do wrong? And how can we do better? The Christian does the same thing. We meet around the table each week, right? It's in remembrance of me. We'll talk about it here in just a second. But we should use that time to not just think about what was done for us, but what have we done to earn that? We'll get to that a little bit more here in just a second. Christ's death is the ultimate memorial. Turn in Romans chapter 5. I want to look at verses 6, 7, and 8. Romans chapter 5, verses 6, 7, and 8. For when we were still without strength, in due time, Christ died, notice, for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man, someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. If we read that, it says, or at least I sort of read that to say, for somebody who's righteous, for somebody who's real good, I might die for them. But that list is going to be pretty small, right? We've talked about this in here before, the number of people that we would die for. It's a pretty small list, right? But notice that at the end in verse 8, it says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Not even that we had said, I promise to be better, and then Christ died for us. No, it was while we were still doing wrong, Christ died for us anyway. Now, that's a lot of faith on his part, right? That I'll do this and they'll do better. Christ's death provides freedom from sin and assures us eternal life. So how should we remember that? Well, we remember that around the table each week. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, 23 to 26, it's been read from this pulpit numerous times, but it simply says, do this in remembrance of me. Communion is a continual, purposeful act of memory and proclamation. It's continual, meaning that we do it quite often. I said that earlier about driving past someplace and you haven't thought about it in 20 years. Well, that's not a continual remembrance, is it? And some of those places have been 10, 20 years since then, and I've not thought about it again since then, right? But communion around the table is a continual remembrance. We do it weekly because it's important. Those things that I don't remember from when I was a junior in high school probably weren't that important to begin with. This is far more important. It is a purposeful act of memory. How many of you have ever said, I will not forget that, and have forgotten it, right? When you was little, they might have they tie a string around your finger to help you remember. I always thought, how's that going to help? But it makes sense, right? It's like, why is that? Oh, there's that. How many of you have said, as you walk out the door in the morning, I need to do this, this, and this. And then when you go to bed, you think, oh, need to do this. Didn't do any of them. Completely forgot about them, right? I've taken to putting things on my phone calendar that it will pop up at the exact time to say, do this. It is not important if I'm not remembering it, okay? But if I am a purposeful remembrance, I'm making a note of it, then that's important. We do this every Sunday with purpose, not as a habit, not as a ritual, but as a memory, a memorial of thankfulness for what was done for us. Acts chapter 20 and verse 7 said, now on the first day of the week, the disciples came together to break bread. Those people did the same as we do. Those were people that lived with Jesus, that knew Jesus. Those are probably people that had been taught by Jesus. And it was important enough for them to do it there today. You know, we spend this weekend remembering those who gave their life for this country. But we spend the first day of the week remembering the one who gave his life for the whole world. So lives worthy of sacrifice. I was getting real nervous a minute ago when Dad mentioned he'd watched some movies and stuff like that. I was nervous. I thought my line was going to be stepped over. But most of you, maybe not most of you, a lot of you, I'm sure, have seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, right? Came out in 98, I believe it was, and it's set in World War II, D-Day in 1944. And at the end, and if you've not seen it yet, spoiler alert, but if you've not seen it yet, you'll just have to hear this. But at the end, Tom Hanks' character, who has led this group of people to find this Private Ryan, he dies at the end. But as he's dying, he's on a bridge, and he grabs Matt Damon, who's Ryan, and he says, to earn this. That's the two words that he says. And in the story, in the movie, all of these people get killed along the way. Essentially, it was a trade-off. 10 people died for one person to live. But he says to earn this. If someone is willing to sacrifice themselves for us, then we have to be willing to live a life worthy of that sacrifice. Our freedom in Christ shouldn't be an example or an opportunity for us to do whatever we want, but rather it should compel us to live even better. Romans chapter 12, let's look at verses 1 and 2 real quick. Paul wrote to the Romans in chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. He said, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies. You've heard this before, but he says, as a living sacrifice. So I'm sacrificing myself through life constantly to God. A living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is, notice there he says this, your reasonable service, all right? We probably use that word before. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect you to do this, right? Clean your room, whatever it might be. A reasonable service is not asking for too much. based on what was done for us. He said, being your reasonable service. But he also goes on in verse 2 and he says, to not be conformed to the world, but be transformed, renewing, notice, your mind, that you may prove what is good and acceptable, perfect will of God. He says that what Christ did for us should then make us want to be better for him. We can't be perfect, but we can live a life worthy of the sacrifice. We should reflect on ways to serve others, both here and in the community. You know, I said at the beginning that very few of us would ever be in a situation where guns are firing and we might be killed in the line of duty. There's a few of you that have been in those spots, but most of us never will. So our sacrifice won't look like that. What sacrifices do we have to give today? Well, time, energy, love, forgiveness, and that may be the hardest sacrifice of all for us sometimes, right? Galatians chapter 5 and verse 13 says, you, brethren, have been called to liberty. But he said, only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. We've been granted a second chance, as it were. That's what baptism does for us. That's what Jesus' death does for us, right? We've done wrong. We've given a second chance, this liberty that we have. But we read there in Galatians 5 and 13 to not use that freedom as a chance to just do better for me, but rather to do better for others, to sacrifice to help others, whatever the case might would be. So Memorial Day for us should be a call to readiness. I dare say that every military stone, wherever the cemetery is, Camp Nelson or Nancy, but even at small grave sites at churches or family cemeteries, I'd say most every military stone in most every cemetery is a man or a woman that expected to come home. Many did. But whether a soldier or civilian, our time comes as well. There are gravestones that are not military of people who expected to come home that day and didn't make it home either. And so what we have to do is we have to make sure that our hope is not in this life, but that our hope is in something better. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 through 18. I want to read as we wrap up. But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus. For this we say to you by the word of the Lord, we who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will by no means precede those who are asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. Those in the grave have lived their life. They've ran their race. We have our own life to live, but just this one. And however long it is, it'll end too quick. But we have to live a life worthy of the sacrifice of God and be comforted by the fact that what Paul wrote to Thessalonians there and what we just read, that when it's over, when it's finished, thus we shall always be with the Lord. Make it right. Find your way there. Whatever it is, whatever you need, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.